Well, hello everyone, and welcome to my first ever attempt to use the Substack video post capability as I try to record a few thoughts here in preparation for our upcoming read along of Plato's Republic. If you're watching this, you belong to one of two groups. Either you're a student in my honors seminar this semester on Plato's Republic, and you're watching because I told you you had to, or you are a subscriber to From My Bookshelf and are hoping to read the Republic along with us, or at least get some thoughts about the Republic, learn a little bit about the Republic, even if you don't have time to read the whole dialogue yourself. Although I'm hoping many of you will take advantage of the opportunity to read along. In this video, I want to share a few sort of preparatory introductory thoughts about how to read a Platonic dialogue. Whenever I teach Plato, I always try to take a little time at the beginning of our first class to say some things about how to approach a Platonic dialogue, because reading Plato is not like reading most philosophy. Some of you may have read Plato before. Some of you may have read the Republic before. If you have, you know that Plato typically writes dialogues. Dialogues are not like your standard philosophical treatise. So most of the time, if you pick up a work of philosophy, if you pick up something by Kant or Hegel, or perhaps something by somebody more appealing than either Kant or Hegel, what you get is a treatise, right? You get a work in which the author tells you what he or she thinks fairly straightforwardly, wants you to know, wants you to be persuaded. So it begins by laying out the premises for the argument and then sort of proceeds logically step by step, moving from one idea to the next, working his or her way through the argument, leading you finally to a conclusion. And so by the end of it, we're supposed to know exactly what the author thinks about the subject in question. So there's a kind of straightforward, linear, progressive element to that as we move from premise to conclusion, from start to finish. And by the end, we know exactly what we've got. Reading a dialogue by Plato is not like that. It's not a treatise. It doesn't move from start to finish. It doesn't lay out its premises. It doesn't tell us what the conclusions are. It's a conversation. And like a conversation, it circles around on itself in various ways. Reading a dialogue is in many respects more like reading a play. Actually, a play has a setting, it has a time and a place, a location where it occurs. The Republic is going to occur in a particular place. We'll learn at the very beginning of the dialogue where this conversation is being held. And in fact, the location may be of some significance. We might think about why Plato has the dialogue set where he does. A play has a cast of characters, right? And this is of some importance, I think, for reading a Platonic dialogue. When we read Plato, we are getting specific people, often real historical individuals, in some cases quite well-known people, other times they're less well-known to us. But these are real people with characters, with personalities, with particular traits, with ways of approaching the world. In the Republic, the two main conversation partners, the two young men who will become Socrates' chief interlocutors over the course of the dialogue, are a pair of people named Glaucon and Adeimantus. They are real people. They're brothers. And in fact, they're not just any brothers. They're Plato's own brothers. He put his own brothers in the dialogue talking to Socrates. And as you'll see, they have somewhat different characters. They respond to Socrates in somewhat different ways. What Socrates has to say to them may be related to the different kinds of people that they are and what he thinks will appeal to the one as opposed to appealing to the other. So it's a little bit more like reading a play than it is like reading your typical philosophical treatise. But it's also, again, it's a conversation, right? And so we want to think a little bit about the nature of a conversation and how that relates to how a dialogue unfolds as we encounter it. If you have a conversation with your friends, right, it doesn't usually go kind of clearly and straightforwardly in a linear fashion from start to finish. You don't have all of your ideas clear at the beginning. You don't go step by step in a perfectly logical manner. If you were to sit down with a set of friends to talk about what justice is, the topic of the Republic, and I'm sure most of you probably do that with your friends all the time, right? Sit down in the evening for a casual conversation about the nature of justice. If you were to do that, you would not, in fact, have all of your thoughts clearly articulated at the beginning of the conversation, right? You would try an idea out and someone would respond, and you might discover that you needed to reformulate a thought, that you needed to go back and refine a definition. You might circle back and sort of recover some ground that you had talked about once already. You wouldn't have it all worked out. In much the same way as if I were to look at the transcript of this video when I'm done, I would probably discover all sorts of embarrassing slips of the tongue and foolish things I'd said and ungrammatical sentences because I don't have my thoughts all prepared and clearly organized. That's how a conversation is, right? We don't really know exactly what we think until we get through the process of conversing itself, and only in retrospect do our thoughts begin to get clear and come into focus for us. And so, reading Plato's dialogues, reading the Republic, is very much like that. Right? People will put forward a view, and typically Socrates will ask them questions about it then, and then they'll refine that view. And so, just as you might say things later in a conversation that were different or from, or maybe even contradictory to things you had said earlier in the conversation, so too you'll find that kind of dissonance within the dialogue. People will say things that don't quite fit exactly with things they said earlier because we don't have all of our ideas clearly worked out in our own minds. And so you need to be willing to kind of work with that messiness of conversation as you read a Platonic dialogue. Let the ideas unfold and think about how a version of an idea that is formulated at one time might be different from a version formulated another time, and what those differences might signify or have to teach us. Now, it's also worth thinking about Socrates himself. Socrates had a reputation in his own lifetime already for being ironic. This was the kind of standard adjective that was applied to Socrates. People said he was ironic. What did they mean by that? Well, when we call somebody ironic, what we usually mean is that the person says one thing and means something a little different, or that the things that that person says have kind of a double meaning, right? This is sort of surface meaning, but also another layer behind it where the irony is concealed. So people thought that Socrates was somebody who didn't tell you exactly what he believed, that he said one thing and meant something different. Again, in the Republic, you will encounter fairly early on in Book One a character named Thrasymachus who is quite angry with Socrates for precisely this reason. Thrasymachus will complain that Socrates doesn't tell you what he thinks, and Thrasymachus regards that as a somewhat dishonest or even cowardly mode of approach. Like a real man would come out and tell you what he thought from the beginning and not kind of hide behind these vague formulations or just asking you questions all the time and never telling you what he thinks. So we're gonna see that as a criticism of Socrates right early on. But Socrates had this reputation. I think part of that is related to the nature of conversation. Right? Socrates was somebody who asked questions, and as we go through that questioning process, we say things, we try ideas out that change, that evolve over time. We also don't approach everybody in the same way, right? You have different friends, and they have different characters, and you talk to them in different ways. The argument that you might make to appeal to one of your friends and persuade that person won't necessarily be the same argument you would make to another friend because you know something else is calculated to appeal to that person and be persuasive in that context. And so you don't always say the same things, even in defense of the same ideas. And Socrates is probably the same way, right? He probably doesn't make the same kind of arguments to Glaucon that he makes to Adeimantus or to somebody else, because he's dealing with different people and trying to be persuasive in different ways. But people also got frustrated, and this is an experience that's common with readers, with students, and I find over the years, students will very frequently get frustrated as they read a Platonic dialogue because they think the arguments often just aren't very good. They're not persuaded by what they read. In fact, you'll see, it's a little bit humorous almost, that as you go along, Socrates will say things, and these young guys he's talking to will respond just by kind of nodding their heads saying, "Yes, Socrates, yes, that looks right, Socrates, yes, absolutely, Socrates, definitely, sir." And Socrates sort of carries them along, right, by, I guess, the force of his personality, or because they're not quite up to the task of disagreeing with him and trying to rebut him. But students will sometimes kind of kick against that a little bit, particularly when they find arguments that aren't so persuasive, because here these guys are just sort of nodding and going along with it. And if you're reading and thinking, well, wait a minute, that didn't make sense to me, then those interlocutors in the dialogue don't seem terribly bright, and you might get a little annoyed with them. But I think actually this is a really important experience, an important moment in the dialogues, when you come across something that seems to you less than persuasive. When those moments happen, and they will happen early, I think. In Book One of the Republic, you will encounter arguments that are not compelling, and in some cases, you may encounter arguments that just seem almost like kind of downright crazy or bad, where you'll think that's bizarre. How could anybody think that was a persuasive argument? When that happens, don't just sort of blow past it and assume, well, Plato was writing 2,500 years ago. He hadn't figured some things out, right? Or Plato, he's maybe not quite as bright a guy as we thought he was. Or Socrates says these things and doesn't realize that they don't make any sense. Don't just kind of assume that you see this flaw in the argument that would have been totally hidden from Socrates or Plato. Stop and think about it a little bit. Chew over those moments. When you come across something in the dialogue that does not persuade you, that is exactly the time to stop and think and ask questions. So why did Socrates say that? Did he really mean that? Is this a moment? Is he being ironic? Is he not saying what he means, or is he saying it because he's trying to persuade this particular character? Depend on who he's talking to. Is he saying it because the person he's talking to isn't quite ready to understand his real view, and maybe he'll get to that later on? Like, what is going on? Why is he saying these things? And if they don't make sense, what's the problem with the argument? Try to figure out why it's not working. What is the difficulty? And argue back a little bit, right? And I think when that happens, that is actually what is supposed to be happening in a Platonic dialogue. That is Plato's goal, right? If you ask me, why does Plato write dialogues? Ultimately, my own answer would be that he writes dialogues, he writes conversations because he wants you, his reader, to become a character in the dialogue, wants you to become a participant in the conversation. And so when he dangles little invitations in front of you and kind of says, don't you want to argue back, right? Invites you in like that. Take advantage of those opportunities, because these are the times when you join in the activity of philosophy itself. Ultimately, Plato wants you also to philosophize. Socrates wants you to philosophize. They want you to join in their activity. And so ask the questions, take advantage of those moments when you find yourself frustrated or confused or irritated, when the arguments don't seem persuasive. Ask yourself why not. Those are the times to join in. And I hope that as you go through it, if you're reading along, again, I hope that many of you will take advantage of the opportunity to read along. Even if you don't, perhaps as you read my own thoughts over the coming months, I hope that it will be an opportunity to kind of join in that activity of philosophizing together with Plato, together with Socrates. That's really what this is about, to get us thinking ourselves, what is justice? What is the nature of the human soul? What is human life and community? What is the purpose of the polity? All of these things are questions that Socrates is prompting us to think about. What kind of life should I lead? Perhaps the most important of them ultimately. Those are things that Plato wants you to be asking. And so I hope that you will also become a member of the cast of characters of Plato's Republic, a participant in this ongoing conversation that has been going on for 2,500 years or so now. So I look forward to covering this ground with you in the weeks ahead. In the text that accompanies this video post, I have copied the schedule for what we'll be reading when, again, so you can find that there. And I look forward to seeing your comments as we read, or if you're my student in class, to hearing them in person and working through. And I think it's going to be a fun opportunity to revisit this great classic text at the foundation of Western philosophy.